We've got another minute and then we're going to get started. My name is Louisa Householder. I'm president of the West Virginia Beekeepers Association. I'd like to welcome all of you to the 4th edition of the WVBA Speaker Series. And we have with us today Steve Roth, and he's from Wheeling, and he's with the Tri-State Beekeepers Association. He's actually the president of the club. He serves as treasurer for the WVBA Association, and then he's also chairman of the Master Beekeeper Program. So we'd like to welcome Steve and thank him for presenting this evening. And once again, thank you all for attending.
As Louisa said, we'd like to welcome you all to the program tonight. I really enjoy presenting, and I really enjoy presenting with the West Virginia Beekeepers. It's a pleasure for me, and I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that I can kind of give you some ideas that maybe you haven't had, or maybe that are appropriate for this time of the year. And so with that, what I'm going to do is ask that I welcome all the questions. I love the questions, but I'm going to ask you to wait till the end of my presentation to submit your questions in the form of a chat. Louisa will get them and read them to me, and then we'll go ahead and answer all your questions. But through the program or through the presentation, I'm going to refrain from questions before I lose my train of thought really quickly. So I'm going to turn my video off and we'll get started. Louisa, can you take the names off of the right side of the screen so they're just seeing my screen?
Well, go ahead and shut down your video and see if that helps things go away for you.
I still see a list of names on the right side.
Okay. I don't think I can do anything about that. You could hit at the top of that black box, you'll see speaker view. You'll see like a dash. Actually, right there it is. Hide thumbnail video. Click that on your side. Do you see what I'm talking about?
No.
Okay, so you see the list of squares, right?
At the top?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and at the very top of that, there's a toolbar. And on the far left of that is just like a dash, and that hides the thumbnail.
I'm lost.
Okay.
Oh, wait. No, I'm still lost.
Okay, so
Yeah, that took it down. Yeah, okay, that took it down, didn't it?
It did for you. Everybody, that's a toolbar that each individual can use.
Okay.
So if you don't want to see that the thumbnails of everybody's name, then you just go at the top of that box and there's 4 options. You can choose to see everybody, you can choose just to see the speaker, or you can take it away altogether.
Okay. All right. So they can control that. All right.
They control that for themselves.
So with that in mind, let me begin. My topic for tonight is swarms and swarm prevention, and it's probably a very appropriate topic for this time of year. For this is swarm season is coming on now, and so hopefully I can give you some ideas that you can make use of. So let's start by talking about a swarm. What a swarm is. Initially, the bees, for one reason or another, realize that they want to swarm, so they'll start by making a queen cell, and in that cell they grow a new virgin queen who will remain in the colony while the mother queen is forced out. Just a day or so before the new queen hatches out, they'll force the mother queen out, and with her goes about 1/3 to 1/2 of the colony. And when they swarm, it's just an exceedingly random activity occurring outside of the hive where bees are flying everywhere. And if you've ever experienced it, it's a real thrill. Those bees are full of honey. They really can't easily sting. And so standing right there in front of them, you'll have bees bouncing off of you everywhere. And it's an experience. And so when they swarm like that, the queen is a poor flyer. And so she'll fly a short distance and light at some spot. In my yard, it's usually 50 or 60 feet high in a tree, well out of reach. But you see them in a bush, on the side of a house, on the side of a car, on a parking meter. You see a collection of bees that people call the swarm. And that's actually called a bivouac. And in that, the queen is located, and the balance, or the bulk of the bees that are swarming form around her. During that period of time, there are scout bees out looking for a site to house the new colony. There may be 100 to 200 scout bees out roaming around looking for the appropriate site. They're looking for a site that's about 10 to 15 feet in the air. They want an opening with a southeast exposure so the weather is behind them. They're looking for a site that has a small opening so that they can defend it against predators. They're looking for a site that's about 2 liters in volume. You may, if you're a beekeeper, you're familiar with what's called the waggle dance, where the bees will go out, find appropriate source of pollen or nectar, come back and do a dance in the colony to direct her sisters as to where to go. Well, the swarm does a similar thing. The scouts all come back as they find a location, maybe in a hollow tree. If the location is really, really good, they'll come back and do a vigorous dance to attract the other scouts to that location. If maybe in the eaves of a house, it's a kind of a moderately, a site of moderate quality, they'll do a less vigorous dance to draw her nestmates to that site. And maybe, I don't know, in a stone wall or something, they find a site that's mediocre, really not that great, but at least it's a site, and the scout will come back and do a dance like that. The scout that's dancing most vigorously will gradually draw more and more scouts to go look at her site. And when 70% of those scouts agree on that one site, if they're drawn to that site, at that point, they'll be coaxed to leave that bivouac and take to the air, flying to the new site. They really don't know where they're going. They're led to that site through an action of the scout bees who have visited that site. And that swarm might be as much as 30 feet long. It may be 25 feet wide. It may be as much as 10 feet tall. And initially it starts to move very slowly, but then it picks up speed, and it may move at a speed up to 7 miles per hour. And generally within 10 to 15 minutes, they've located the new site and begin to take residence. As the swarm approaches the site, there are bees on the threshold of the site fanning their pheromone to draw the bees to that location. But that's the nature of a swarm. Now, why do they swarm? Well, we're going to talk about why they swarm here in a minute, but let me compare this to human beings. In human beings, you constantly make new cells. Cells live, cells die. Constantly there's a turnover of new cells. But that turnover of new cells doesn't sustain the species. The birth of an infant is what sustains the species. And so because of that, human beings have an overwhelming desire to procreate. Read between the lines. They think they're doing it for pleasure, but in reality, they do it to sustain the species. The honeybees are the same thing. The honeybees, in a colony, there are constantly bees that are born, bees that are dies, bees that come and go. That doesn't sustain the species. What sustains the species is the birth of a new colony in the form of a swarm. And so because of that, honeybees have an overwhelming desire to swarm. They don't realize why they're swarming, but they swarm to sustain the species. Now, let me give you another example. I engage in behavior for a lot of different reasons, but maybe not for the main underlying reasons. Let me give you an example. In the refrigerator right now is a piece of steak left over from dinner the other night. Now, when I'm done here and get to hang up on the computer, I'm going to go up and eat that steak. Now, I may do it for a variety of reasons. I may do it because I'm hungry. I may do it because the longer I sit here and talk, the better that steak sounds to taste. Or I may go up and eat that steak because I know my grandson, with an unparalleled appetite, sooner or later is going to come over and eat that steak. And so to avoid that, I'm going to eat it before he gets to it. So I may eat that steak for a variety of reasons, but the real underlying reason that I'm going to eat that steak is for nourishment, to sustain my poor, sorry body from starvation. So I do things for a variety of reasons, but to sustain my well-being. In the same reason, those bees will swarm for a variety of reasons. They may swarm because of increased congestion. They may swarm because there's limited space in there for the brood. The queen's failing, the queen's pheromone is diminishing, or because of a genetic inclination. different strains of bees have different inclinations to swarm. The Russian bees swarm pretty often. Carniolas maybe less frequently, Italians less frequently, and finally buckpasts are not really inclined to swarm at all. But they swarm for a variety of reasons. Possibly there's just too many bees in that colony. There are bees everywhere. There's so much congestion, no room to move, no room to do anything. Maybe there's no room on those frames for brood. Maybe all the cells are taken by brood or by pollen or by honey stores. They have no room to further produce their brood. Maybe, as I say, the queen is failing. Maybe her brood pattern is poor. Maybe she's not giving off sufficient pheromone to maintain what's called homeostasis in the colony. A strong pheromone from the queen will keep things at rest. They'll realize things are good, things are fine. There's no reason to get excited. So let's just stay as it is. As that pheromone diminishes, the bees start to think something's wrong, our queen is failing, and that may become a reason for swarming. So they swarm for a variety of reasons, but what they don't understand or don't realize is they're swarming to sustain the species. So creation of a new colony is the basis for the swarm, but a lot of different things prompt the swarm, primarily congestion. Now, and we're going to talk about that shortly, but they'll swarm primarily because they're congested. They're congested this time of year because they're making a lot of brood and starting to put away stores of pollen and nectar. There's another type of swarm called an absconding swarm. Sometimes the entire colony, not a third of the colony, but the entire colony will pick up and leave. They may leave because there are poor sources of pollen and nectar in the area. They may swarm because they're heavily infested by mites. They may swarm because they're infested by ants. They swarm for a variety of reasons. African honeybees swarm frequently, and the reason they swarm is in Africa, where they live, there are constant floral sources. And so they poorly store honey. Rather, when one floral source is exhausted, they just pick up and swarm to a new site, new floral source. You really can't stop an absconding swarm. That's a completely different type of swarm. What I want to talk about today is how do you stop a swarm from congestion or failing queen. Now, the first thing you want to ask is, do you really want to stop that swarm? If you're concerned about honey production, then probably yes, you do, because when a third of that colony leaves, you lose foragers, you lose bees that are converting that nectar to honey. You're losing production of honey. But if you're not concerned about honey production, you may want to consider allowing those bees to swarm, for that swarm has a lot of benefit to you and to that colony. In the swarm, it breaks up brood congestion. And if you remember, we talked about no room to lay eggs, no room for brood. When it swarms and loses a large population of the bees, suddenly there's a lot of room in that colony for further brood production, and that inclination to further swarm is reduced. That swarm produces a new queen. All right, as I say, they produce a young queen. Shortly before she emerges, the old queen leaves. We talked about the importance of a fertile young queen, number one, to produce the brood, number two, to produce a strong queen pheromone to maintain harmony in that colony. That swarm will produce a new queen for you. And that queen may have traits that you really want to foster. If that hive colony swarms in the early spring, that's coming from a colony that's overwintered. That queen has some traits to her that in part allows the colony to overwinter. Maybe her offspring are disease resistant. Maybe she produces a sufficient level of brood to a large enough population to get them through the winter. Maybe her offspring are good foragers and honey producers. There are traits in that queen that you may want to preserve. Now, granted, when she mates with other drones, that diminishes the strength of those traits, but still, she has some skills in her that you may want to preserve with the new queen. When they swarm, shortly before they begin to swarm, they cut down on brood production. When the new queen comes, she's a virgin queen. She has to go out and mate. She has to go through a process to begin laying eggs. Generally, from the time her egg is laid until she's actually laying a brood, sometimes it's up to a month period before that process occurs. If you remember, we talked about the varroa mite, and the varroa mite feeds on the pupa. In the pupal, they enter the cell in the larval stage, it's capped over, then they feed on the pupa during the pupal stage, and that's where the problems begin. If you have a break in the brood production, you have a break in mite production. Without the brood, the mites can't reproduce. Now, it doesn't eliminate your mite problem, but it sure goes a long way to help to diminish the population of the mites. And so if you're not interested purely in honey production, you may want to seriously consider allowing that colony to go ahead and swarm. Okay, so we decided, all right, we're going to do something to intervene to stop the swarm. And so swarm prevention begins early in the season. As a beekeeper, you want to be proactive. You don't want to be reactive. You don't want to decide to engage in an activity after the thought. You want to be ahead of the bees. And so swarm prevention begins early in the season, even up to a couple of months before the actual nectar flow begins. Timing is essential. You can't be behind the bees. You have to be in front of the bees to prevent the swarm. The first thing you can do early in the spring to prevent the swarm is reversing the hive bodies. This is a thermal imaging picture of this hive on the right side. The deeper the color, the redder the color is more heat generated, and the heat is generated by the cluster of bees. And so in this image, the bees are primarily in the top brood box. If you look at the bottom brood box, there's no activity down there. You don't see the presence of any bees. In the absence of bees, one has to assume that that's just empty frames of drawn comb. No activity down there, nothing to occupy the cells. All the activity is at the top. And so if you want to engage in a behavior to give those bees more room, if congestion is the issue, you reverse them. And in reversing them, all that you do is take the top box where the brood nest is located, put it on the bottom, take the bottom box, which is now empty, it's frames of drawn comb, put it on the top, with the idea that as they eat through that dome of honey and begin to move up during the spring for brood production and collection of stores, they have plenty of space in which to engage in that activity. What you have to be careful of is if you try this early in the spring and that the brood nest straddles the two brood boxes. Half of that nest is in the bottom box, half of that nest is in the top box. If you reverse them, if you take the bottom box and move it to the top, then suddenly this portion of the brood nest is located way at the top of that box. In the same way, if you take the top box with this portion of the brood nest and rotate it down or move it down, then part of the brood nest is down here. Now that brood has to be maintained at a certain temperature for that brood to survive. It has to be held around 92 degrees. And when the cluster is in one position and the bees can be all together in one position, they can maintain that temperature. But if the brood nest is split, some at the very top, some at the very bottom, the bees are unable to maintain an adequate temperature, and some of that brood becomes chilled. It's actually called chill brood, and the brood is damaged. And so engaging in this activity to rotate that, reversing the boxes is very effective in suddenly giving a colony that's up against the wall, literally, plenty of new space above them. It's a very effective way to give them space, to reduce congestion, to give them additional room for brood production and storage of resources. But you have to be careful that you don't do it in a way that splits the brood boxes or the brood nest. Another thing that you can do is equalizing colonies. And I do this. This is a very effective way to accomplish a couple things here. And first, let me preface this by saying, when we run our novice program, we tell the novices, if you talk to 9 beekeepers, you're going to get 10 ways to do things. You're going to get beekeepers with 10 different ways. Everybody has their own way to do it. And I realize that. And so in presenting these measures, I'm going to present my point of view, my preference, my view on it. But I realize this may be completely contrary to some of the things that you believe. And I fully respect your practice, your way of managing bees. And I'm not trying to tell you you're wrong or that you should be doing it this way. I'm simply giving you options in which you can engage to manage the swarms. And in doing so, I'm giving you some of the ways that I engage to manage the swarms. So with that said, as the spring continues to progress and the weather begins to warm a little bit and brood production becomes a little more in swing, I equalize the colonies. And by equalizing the colonies, if you have a colony that has a cluster that occupies a portion of the brood box but doesn't fully fill the brood box, as opposed to a stronger colony who's completely occupying 10 frames of the brood box, full of bees, full of brood, full of stores, you can take from the rich and give to the poor and really significantly reduce some of this tendency to swarm. And it does a couple of other things. All right, so what I'm going to do is take some of these empty frames out and go over to this box and take some of the frames that are full of brood, full of bees, and introduce them in between frames of this brood nest. Now, in doing so, the first thing I have to be very careful of is that when I move this frame, I don't move their queen. If I take their queen out and put it in a weaker box that has their own queen, now I've got 2 queens in the same hive and no queen in this one. Well, 2 queens together, there's only 1 queen that survives in a colony, and so one of those queens is going to be destroyed either by the bees themselves or by the other queen. This hive is suddenly queenless. So in transferring, you have to be very careful that you don't move your queen. But in doing so, what you're doing is increasing the population of this colony while you're diminishing the population and the congestion of this colony. It has been my experience that it takes bees to make bees. And so if this colony doesn't have an adequate population of bees, and suddenly you're adding to that population almost immediately, I have found that it goes a long way to increase brood production in this weaker colony. All right, you may have heard that you can't combine bees. If you take bees and put them in another colony, they're going to go to war. There's a civil war, you can't combine bees. What I think you'll find is if you do this in the afternoon when the foraging bees are out, the foraging bees tend to be the ones that don't mix well. So you're going to take a frame of brood out that's full of nurse bees with no queen and introduce it into this colony in between occupied frames with that brood and with those nurse bees. There seems to be an acceptance without breaking stride. They don't get into a fight. They easily accept each other, and they go on and work in a unified fashion to raise the brood. So in splitting early in the spring, I'm going to reduce the congestion here. I'm going to increase the population of bees here. And do all of that without having to make a split. So I don't have a new colony. I haven't done anything to increase the number of hives that I have if I only want to stay with a limited number. But in doing so, I'm equalizing and reducing congestion. So by equalizing colonies, you can help to minimize the swarm tendency. Another thing you can do is add supers. And when I add supers, the first thing I look for is the creation of white wax. When I see that white wax starting to form, that wax is the bee's way of telling me, we're really crowded in here. We're looking for additional space. Even if you look on the bottom of the inner cover, that when I see that fresh white wax, I know that congestion is becoming an issue. My other trigger for applying supers is some of the people that were my mentors as a beekeeper long ago used to tell me when the red bud is in bloom, that's when you add your supers. Now here in the northern panhandle, our red bud came into bloom probably last week. And those of you that don't know red bud, it's a purple bloom. I at a loss as to know the source of the name, but it's a purple bloom. It's short-lived. It only lasts for about 10 days to 2 weeks, but it's a beautiful little flower, a small tree, shrub, and it's called redbud. It's purple, but it's called redbud. Anyway, at that rate, that's when I add supers. And the super allows the bees room to move up into. If they're into nectar storage, honey production, it gives them empty frames in which to store. Now, I want to make a comment here. You see, this beekeeper has a queen excluder on. And the idea of the queen excluder is to limit the queen from moving up into that super and laying eggs and adding brood. So you don't have brood in among your honey. Well, again, my mentors, the old guys that unfortunately are probably almost all gone now, used to tell me if you exclude the queen, you exclude the honey, that there's not good honey production above. And I'm sure there are beekeepers that are going to disagree with that and say, it doesn't matter. You can put that excluder on, keep those bees out of that brood. I don't use queen excluders. What I do is if I get brood up in that super, when I'm pulling frames to extract, if I have brood in it, I just put that frame back in for another 10 days or so. That brood will hatch out. They'll backfill it with honey and no loss. So I personally don't use a queen excluder, but in an attempt to reduce congestion, I do add supers. Now, when I add supers, I'd like to add supers of drawn comb if it's available. If I don't have drawn comb, if I just have foundation, by adding that foundation during a good strong nectar flow, they'll draw it out into comb. You can't do this during a poor nectar flow. You can't do it, for example, into the latter part of June. They just won't draw it out. But with our nectar flow just coming on, the application of foundation, they'll draw that out into drawn comb. So adding supers is a way to reduce congestion. Another thing you can do is called checkerboarding. And so let's say here we have our brood box and we have the brood nest in there and it's getting congested. You want to do something to try to reduce it. What you can do is move the empty frames of drawn comb in between each box of the brood. And to a degree, you're separating that brood, but if you do this a little bit later in the spring, so it's not as cold outside, they can manage that brood without running into problems with chill. When you have bees in a box, in a brood box, and there's a dome of honey above it, in other words, there's a little bit of residual honey left above those bees as the spring wears on, they won't really readily cross that dome. In other words, they'll come to that dome and won't go above it. Because of that, it just adds to the congestion below the dome. By checkerboarding, you're opening doors through that comb or that dome of honey, and you're giving them areas where they can move up into the box above. So when you do this, oftentimes you have to add a box above it to give them room to move to. But this allows you to break the congestion, to give them room to move, but without having to engage in a split. So when you do it, it looks something like this. Again, it works best with drawn comb, but in the midst of a heavy nectar flow, foundation will work, but drawn comb seems to work better. So they have room for laying the brood, they have room to move up into the boxes above. Checkerboarding goes a long way in reducing congestion among the bees. To do this, though, as I say, oftentimes you have to put a box above them. And the idea is just to keep them busy making comb, keep them busy moving up with brood and with storage of nectar and the pollen. Okay, another thing you could do is make splits. Splits are of tremendous value to you. And the way, I don't want to go into detail on making splits. That's almost a completely different topic for presentation. But in making splits, for the most part, what you do is take 2 or 3 frames of brood with the nurse bees on, put them in a small nucleus box, 5-frame, 6-frame nucleus box. Add maybe a frame of honey, maybe a frame of pollen, and you may or may not add a queen. Again, as I say, I don't want to go into great detail here, but when you make that transfer, you want to make sure you don't take your queen out of the parent box to put it in there. But when you start that nucleus, you may add a queen in a queen cage for them to take. You may engage in activities to let them draw out a queen, and there's a variety of different ways to stimulate them to make queen cells and queens. But what you're doing is reducing the congestion here, taking all of that heavily populated comb brood and put it in another box with another queen to make another colony. If you're interested in increasing the number of hives or colonies that you have, this is an excellent way to do it. So you can increase the size of your apiary with a split. As I say, that split is of tremendous value to you. If you have problems with a failing queen, if you have problems with poor brood production, if you want to draw out foundation into comb, that nuke will assist you in a variety of ways. That nuke is a factory for drawn comb. Last year I took out a lot of the old comb that I had. Yeah, right, the 25-year-old drawn comb. I apologize, my fault. But I took out a lot of my old drawn comb and started making new comb with nukes. And it was like a factory. I mean, they'd fill one, I'd pull it out, I'd put a foundation in, they'd make one, I'd pull it out. And I made probably 50 or 60 different frames of drawn comb just from my nukes. The other nice thing about the nuke is it's nice for queen production, and it works well to take congestion off of here. Again, you have to be careful you don't transfer your queen. If you take the queen out of this box and put it in here, you haven't done anything to help yourself. Rather, you've done a lot to hurt yourself. Now you have a queenless colony, and your parent colony is queenless. All right, checkerboarding. The other thing you can do is introduce a new queen. As I said, a young queen that's fertile or a young queen that puts off a strong pheromone is of benefit to that colony. The older queen, as her pheromone begins to diminish, as her egg pattern diminishes, that stimulates a swarm. And so if you maintain young queens, you'll diminish the tendency to swarm. Every year I put in new queens. So in the springtime coming on, they have a queen that I introduced at the end of last year. She's a young queen, her pheromones are strong. That helps to minimize swarming tendency. But what you have to be careful of is if you have a colony that's inclined to swarm and you put a young queen in that colony at that point, you haven't done anything to take the pressure off of the swarm. They're still congested. They still have an inclination to swarm to produce new space. And so when they swarm, they're going to swarm with your new young queen, leave her and leave you with a queen cell in the parent colony. And so doing that really doesn't help you a lot. You doing this more at midsummer, June, July, requeening with a young queen sets you up for this time of year, for the spring of the following year. And introduction of a queen with the use of a queen cage. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail for you new beekeepers who haven't seen this process, but by placing a new queen in the queen cage gives them a few days to get used to her and her pheromones, and they're less inclined to hurt her when she's finally released. Okay, another thing you can do is cage or remove the queen. As a swarm becomes imminent, caging the queen will keep her from swarming. She can't go out, and in cage she's unable to lay more brood, and so brood production in a congested hive is not an issue. While she's caged, the nurse bees can continue to feed her, to manage her through that cage. But this is kind of a temporary thing, because if you cage her for a long period of time and she can't lay, she begins to lose some of the ability to lay, and her brood pattern will gradually diminish. But caging her for a brief period of time until the nectar flow is over, till the swarm season is subsiding, may be effective. Again, as I say, removing that queen to make a new splits will diminish the tendency to swarm. But caging or removing the queen may be a last ditch effort to minimize the inclination to swarm. Some beekeepers will put as a queen excluder between the bottom board and the bottom of the lower brood nest, with the idea if that queen can't get out, they can't swarm. They'll hold her in there, she can't swarm. Well, that doesn't take away the desire to swarm. You just stop them from swarming with that queen. What they may do is wait for the new queen. There's a queen cell in there. Wait for that queen to hatch out. That virgin queen who hasn't mated yet, her abdomen hasn't begun to swell, she can easily slip through that queen excluder. And suddenly your colony has swarmed with a virgin queen, leaving the mother queen in the colony. So this really doesn't completely stop the ability to swarm, and it certainly doesn't take away the desire to swarm. The other thing that could happen here, and in extreme cases, the drones can't pass through that cage. And if there are a large population of drones in that colony trying to get out, that has the potential of creating a block to ventilation by congesting that swarm cage at the bottom, a swarm excluder at the bottom of the hive. I don't know that that's actually the case, but there's potential in that. And regardless, I would not recommend placing a queen excluder at the bottom of the cage, because they still have the desire to swarm. You haven't stopped that. All you did was possibly delay it. Clipping the wings of the queen. All right, I told you 10 beekeepers, 9 beekeepers, 10 ways to do it. And that enters into play here. You can buy a queen with clipped wings. You can even clip the queen's wings. Lots and lots of beekeepers do it. Lots of beekeepers swear by it. I do not do it. And I do not do it for a couple of reasons. Number one, the idea of clipping her wings so she can't fly, and the idea that if she can't fly, they can't swarm. Well, nobody told her she can't fly. And so with the congestion, with the inclination to swarm, the preparation to swarm, the new queen cells about ready to hatch out, they're going to push that queen out in the swarm. Now she can't fly, and she may get airborne for 10 or 15 feet, then she's down. And she's down. She can't get up, she can't fly. She doesn't even know where she is. She's down. That swarm is going to exit the colony, exit the hive, go out, bivouac somewhere, realize we don't have the queen. Where'd the queen go? So they're going to return back to that colony, realizing without a queen they can't pursue a swarm. Return to that colony. So now the colony is queenless, but they have a queen cell that's developing as a result of the swarm. That queen cell hatches out as a virgin queen. They're going to swarm with that virgin queen. So now they're out in a new colony with a virgin queen who has to go through the mating flight, has to begin developing to maturity so that she can lay the eggs and begin the brood. So you've delayed the whole process. You've got a colony that's swarmed, maybe left with the only virgin queen in that colony. Your mother queen is laying out in the field somewhere, unable to get back into the hive, and now they're queenless. The other thing that might happen is she hits the ground right outside of the landing board, crawls up underneath the hive. There she sits. They bivouac. Suddenly, you've got a problem, and this has happened to me. You've got a problem, and I'm asking you, what do you do? Because I wasn't sure what to do. I don't want this to happen. And so because of that, I don't clip the wings of the queen. If you're going to swarm, let them survive elsewhere. Let me deal with the problem of the residual bees in the colony, but I don't clip the wings of the queen. Some do, and I'm not critical of those that do, but I don't. I don't. All right, so we've talked about ways of minimizing the swarm. All right, now what do you do if you see that swarm coming? Well, first of all, early indications of that swarm, if they're building up a lot of pollen, a lot of stores of pollen, if they're storing a lot of resources just in general, putting away a lot of honey, reducing the area available for brood production, that's one inclination. As I said, white wax tells me, brother, we're out of space. We're doing something desperate to give us more space. We're out of space. When I see that, I know that I had better act in some way. If I see increased production in general, and specifically increased brood production to a large degree, I get a little concerned about that. Now, they're not producing drones to mate with their virgin queen. Nature has developed a couple of ways that minimizes that the mother doesn't mate with bees out of her own colony. But when they're starting to make drones, they're realizing swarm season is here. There are going to be swarms. There's a need for drones. So we're going to add to that population of drones. This is called a queen cup, all right? Queen cups occur all throughout that colony for sometimes no real reason at all. My mentor used to tell me that's baby bees playing. They'll make them, they'll take it down. They'll make them, they'll take it down. Swarm cups by themselves really don't mean anything. But if you start to see swarm cups with larvae in it, that tells you you've got a problem coming. So what do you do early on? Well, you remove the queen cups as much as you can, and you have to look all through that colony to find those queen cups. Again, without going into detail, oftentimes those swarm cells are formed on the bottom of the frames. And some beekeepers just simply flip the brood box up, look at the bottom of the frame. If there's no swarm cells there, they're comfortable, they're not going to have a swarm. Well, in reality, for a variety of reasons, the bees will put those swarm cells all throughout the frames. And so if you're going to examine, you really have to go frame to frame to frame, looking for swarm cells or queen cups or swarm cells within that colony. You can add additional frames of drawn comb, trying to give them additional space. Consider removing the queen or making splits, trying to reduce the congestion, trying to reduce the egg production, trying to give them more space in there. For congestion is one of the primary sources or primary causes of the swarm. If you get to the point where you've got an egg or larva in a queen cup, if you have actual queen cells forming and well formed, you're on the verge of a swarm. If you see a queen cell with the dome softening out, shallowing out, that swarm is very imminent. They're on the verge of a swarm if they have not already swarmed. They're on the verge of a swarm at that point. So what can you do? Well, you can remove the queen cells. Again, as I say, you have to go through each frame to frame to frame to find those cells and make sure you get them out. But in doing this, a couple of things. Number one, if you successfully remove that queen cell and you do it without harming the queen cell, they're very, very frail at this point. But if you can remove those queen cells without doing any harm to it, you can use those to introduce into another colony to make a split. If I have this, rather than try to remove that queen cell, I'll take the whole frame with the queen cell intact on the face of the frame, and I'll introduce that into a queenless colony in a split to make a new split. The other thing you have to do if you're going to remove queen cells, you have to be very, very careful that queen, your mother queen, is still in that colony. Remember I said just a day or two before that virgin queen emerges, the swarm will exit the colony. And so they may have already swarmed if you're looking at this condition. And so what you have to do is be very, very careful that you have that queen. You have to actually visually identify that queen in the colony before you remove the queen cells. Because if you remove all of the queen cells and they've already swarmed, you're stuck with a queenless colony and with very little recourse for there probably are no eggs in that colony that you can work with, eggs or young larvae to develop a new queen. So aggressively, what you do is you have to remove the queen cells, consider removing the queen or making splits, and the colony is ready to swarm. If you get into your colony and you see this, they have swarmed. If you see one queen cell where the bottom is chewed out, where that queen has emerged from that cell, and then you see other queen cells with the sides that are chewed out, what has happened is this queen emerged first before all of her potential sister queens. She then chews open the side and stings that other queen to kill it. So there's only one queen in the colony. Just as an aside, the stinger of the queen is not barbed. And so she can sting other bees without actually losing her stinger. The worker bees, when they sting, lose the stinger and the glands attached to it. She does not. But if you see this, she has gone through, chewed off the walls of the other cells, stung the queen in the pupal stage to kill it. So she's the only queen that emerged. They have already swarmed. You're behind the action here. They have already swarmed. So if they've swarmed, well, here's where does that leave you as the beekeeper? If you've been ahead of them and you've put up swarm traps in the area, maybe you've been lucky enough to capture that swarm in a nuke box or a trap and return them back to your apiary in a new colony. You can't put them back in the original box. You have to put them in a new hive. Maybe they're in a branch low enough that you can retrieve them that way. My swarms, their rule of thumb is 70 feet in the air. Nobody in my neighborhood, nobody in my yard swarms low. Some beekeepers have a vacuum system that allows them to vacuum the swarms off into a box, like, and they have, it amounts to like a package. They can dump it then into a deep brood box and go from there. But if they've already swarmed, these are your options to try to recover the swarm. But as a beekeeper, if you have not been aggressive, if you have not worked to minimize the chance of a swarm, if they have swarmed, and if you have not been able to capture that swarm, then it's bye-bye, baby, goodbye. They're gone. And that's the end of my story, and I'm holding to it. So with that in mind, let me do this. Let me turn on my video. Let me turn off my screen so you can see me. And as I said, if you have questions, if you forward them to Lisa in the form of a chat, she'll let me know what your questions are and we'll get them answered. All right? Questions? No questions. I've lost everybody. Louisa, you there?
I am here.
All right. Any questions?
It was my understanding that, oh, wait a minute, we have a question from Eileen Harvey. When you have nukes building comb, do they build comb all summer?
They build comb where there's a nectar flow on. They need honey to make comb. They make the wax out of the honey. When they have honey coming in, they'll make the comb. If there's not a nectar flow on, then they won't make the comb. But if when there's a nectar flow on, you keep pouring frames into them, foundation into them, they make it like a factory. It seems like when they're congested, when they're in a small area like that, they're a factory. As I said, nukes are of tremendous value to you. Jamie Alice from University of Florida, who is one of the front runners in practical beekeeping right now, suggests 2 nukes for every 5 hives you have, 5 colonies. So nukes are a tremendous resource for you. And we have been really encouraging our young beekeepers to get into nuke production just as a fallback to solve some of the potential problems you'll run into as a beekeeper. Okay.
All right, you have a couple comments. One from Amy and Otto, very thorough explanation. Hudson says, just to be sure that newer beekeepers understand that we are responsible beekeepers, we as responsible beekeepers should prevent our hives from swarming, right?
I can't agree with that wholeheartedly. For swarms are of benefit to the colony. It's a way of reproducing other colonies, and that sustains the species. So a swarm is not a terrible thing. Swarm is a bad thing if you're a honey producer, but if you're not a honey producer, swarm is nature's way. I mean, the bees in the wild swarm without intervention at all. I mean, they just swarm. And so I'm not going to say good beekeeper will prevent swarms. I will say a good beekeeper who is producing honey will prevent swarms. But if your intent is not honey production, even if your intent is pollination, the swarm is not a bad thing. Okay?
Gerald asks, swarm about the same time every year, swarm late in summer, thoughts?
Swarm late in summer, well, swarm every time of the year. They swarm when there's a heavy nectar flow on. The bees know what they're doing, and they know that they need resources at the new site. They need to make comb right away. And so prior to the swarm, they've engorged themselves with honey so that when they get to the new site, they can start out and make comb for brood. They know that they also have to rapidly increase their stores over the shortened summer, so they have adequate stores for the winter. And so they know what they're doing for the most part, although there are some stupid bees. I captured a swarm last September, and I thought, what on earth are you people doing? And sometimes that's prompted by disease, sometimes it's prompted by infestation, prompted for a variety of reasons. But they swarm in the fall, and I'm sure as a beekeeper, you've seen a lot of that. I captured the swarm. It was about softball size. I've nursed that thing all winter long in a styrofoam nuke. I just checked it today, and doggone if they don't have a queen and they're making bees. But they would have never survived had I not sustained them with the styrofoam for heat and plenty of stores. I added honey to them for the winter. So they'll swarm at any time, but primarily when a heavy nectar flow is on in the springtime. That's swarm season.
So David asks, what is your opinion on making a split with the old queen and putting a new queen in the original hive? Does this stimulate a swarm or simulate a swarm?
If you put a new queen in a congested hive, that doesn't take away the tendency to swarm, unless they're swarming because the mother queen is of decreasing pheromone and maybe poor brood pattern. Although it's kind of a last-ditch effort. You would do that early in the season before they really get to a swarm mode. For example, if you know you have an old queen, you're not seeing a good brood pattern through the early part of the spring, it's sporadic maybe, a new queen at that point would possibly solve the problem. However, if you wait until the congestion's an issue, heavy brood patterns an issue, it looks like they're getting to the point where they're thinking about swarming, and you put a new young queen in, you haven't resolved the problem. Rather, you may have added to the problem by putting a more fertile queen in who's going to further increase the brood production. So timing is an issue. Reading the circumstances is an issue. Depending upon the circumstances, a new queen is of benefit or maybe not such a benefit, more part of the problem. New queen in a split or old queen in a split, either one works fine. If I'm going to add a new queen in, say, end of June, and I've drawn out a queen, raised a queen, she's a queen that I like her characteristics, I'm going to put her in the parent hive. I'll take the old queen and make a split. I hate to kill a queen. Some things I just can't do. I can't do that. I can't eat coconut. I can't kill a queen. Makes me queasy. But anyway, I may take that old queen and make a split out of that, and just to have a queen in reserve if I need it, so again, you really have to read the circumstances, read the timing, and as you evolve as a beekeeper, and as you rely on your local club for input, and as you fall back on a mentor, all of those things go to make you a good beekeeper when everything is said and done.
All right, we've got several other questions here. When there are cells on the side of the comb, are they queen or are they supersedure? I've been thinking, there's a little bit more. It goes on to say, I've been thinking I'd leave them if they are supersedure, but take them out if they are at the bottom and look like peanuts.
Yeah, if you read your colony and you see poor brood pattern, or you see the absence of a queen, then yeah, I could go along with that. But I have seen swarm cells from congestion on the face of the frame. So what that individual says is correct if you see other conditions in the colony. If you see a solid brood pattern, if you see just boatloads of bees everywhere, that's not a supersedure cell. That's a swarm cell. But if poor brood pattern, diminishing numbers, then yeah, leaving that would be reasonable.
Okay, Michelle asks, does lemongrass essential oil work to attract a swarm to a hive box?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Lemongrass, yeah. A lot of people recommend lemongrass. Some people recommend just old combs from brood nests where the brood has hatched out and left the odor of the in the pupa, larva and pupa. But lemongrass works. Yeah, lemongrass is a good lure for a swarm trap.
Lewis asks, how about just splitting upper box from the lower box and letting the queenless box to form a new queen?
Fine. That's a split in a fashion, and you can do a few things to encourage them to make a queen. You have to watch timing. If you do that, you want to make sure you have brood that has an egg or a 1 or 2 day old larva. As you know, when she lays the egg is upright for 3 days, then it falls over and curls in the larval stage. At that point, when that is a young larva, that will work. If you wait until you have older larvae or just capped brood, they won't draw out a queen. But if you have the right circumstances in that open brood, and you make a split like that, that's called a walkaway split. And I do that sometimes. I personally don't do that a lot because the queens that I raise are queens that I like their characteristic. The colony might be a gentle colony. They don't dump over me when I open the box. They don't run on the frame. They're good honey producers. She's a good brood producer. She lays a lot of eggs. If I have a queen like that, I'm going to breed that queen. I'm going to do a few things to to create queens off of her. But if a walkaway split like that works well. And you can do a couple things to encourage them to draw that larva out into a queen cell. So yeah, good question. That'll work.
Okay, Terry says, I don't understand the frames in nukes. Are you saying add frames to hive and when they build comb, remove the frames and store in nukes? No bees in the nukes, just the frames for future use? I had my first hive last year and they died last winter. Trying again with 2 nukes soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could store drawn comb in a nuke box. No problem with that. Watch for waxworms if there was any brood in it. But yeah, you can do that. What I'm saying is if I want an active nuke, I add about 3 frames of larvae in different stages with the nurse bees, a frame of honey and a frame of pollen. That becomes an active nuke. Now I use that nuke. I may take a frame, once that nuke is established, I may take a frame of brood off of that and put it in a weaker colony to add to that colony. Remember we were talking about equalizing colonies. I may then take a frame of foundation and put back in the space where I took the frame of brood out and let them draw that foundation out into comb. So I've got a manufacturing comb for me. I may take that comb out and put it in storage or put it in another hive that's lacking comb. Maybe they have foundation that they haven't drawn out for one reason or other. So I may add it to a colony to add comb. I may add it to a congested colony, take brood out, put the comb in just to give them more room. But I use the nuke to produce the frames of drawn comb, not necessarily just to store drawn comb in the nuke. Although if you have an empty nuke and want to put 5 frames of drawn comb in it, that's fine. Just watch for waxworms, and that's another lecture.
Okay, Russ asks, when do you catch a swarm, or when you do catch a swarm, should you feed the colony syrup?
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. They're starting from scratch. Even if you put them on drawn comb, if I catch a swarm, I feed it. I feed it until they stop taking the sugar water. Yeah, I feed swarms.
All right. Terry Sigler says, I think the weather is a big issue. Checked hives 2 weeks ago. Weather turned too bad to check. Too bad to check until today. Found swarm cells in several boxes that looked good before. Yeah, that happened to me too.
Yeah, yeah. Weather's an issue. Weather's an issue. Weather may delay a swarm, but that doesn't take away the tendency to swarm. Once the weather clears, they're going to swarm.
Okay, and then Terry Robertson says, also first-year beekeeper. My colony became congested late August. My mentor came to show me how to extract honey, but decided to slip colony instead. Must be split. Had 3 capped queen cells. We never found a new queen, so combined back for winter. Was this what we should have done, or should we have bought a queen for colony split?
Can you read that to me again, please? I'm a little slow on the pickup.
No, that's okay. So the colony in late August, let's see here, it got congested in late August. The mentor came to show him or them how to extract honey, but decided to split the colony instead. It had 3 capped queen cells. We never found a new queen, so they combined it back for winter. Was this what we should have done, or should we have bought a queen for the colony split?
Combined it back. My understanding, they just put it all back together the way it was with the swarm cells and all in it.
I do believe that's what it was.
Yeah. So if they're going to swarm, you hopefully have no loss other than population of bees. They'll draw the swarm cell out to a queen and go from there. What I would have considered doing is using one of those swarm cells and actually making a split. If it's that congested, pull some of the bees out, make a split, use one of those queen cells for the split, leave the other 2 if they do issue a swarm. In doing that, you have to feed. You have to feed heavily, particularly in August. I get real nervous something that late, for they need adequate honey stores for the winter. And so I'd be feeding pretty heavily at that point. But if they look like they were going to swarm, probably intervention to make the most of a bad situation. You have to kind of watch, though, because they're going to be building populations. Now, swarm cells, that says one thing, but just because your colony is increasing in population in August is the cycle, the normal cycle for bees. The queen starts to build up brood August into September, trying to develop enough winter bees to get them through the winter. So you'll see population diminish some through the summer and then begin to build again end of August into September, even into October, as long as there's a nectar flow on and pollen coming in, she'll build. So just because you have a heavily populated colony in the fall doesn't necessarily mean they're going to swarm, but the presence of swarm cells, that adds into the mix then. Okay.
Okay, we had a comment by Hudson to warn new beekeepers to place comb between frames of capped honey or brood so the comb is not drawn out extra wide on the boundary frames.
Okay, okay. Any other questions?
I don't see any additional questions. We'll give him another moment.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, another question?
No, go ahead.
Well, just let me add, it's a real pleasure presenting, and I, in part, hope that I gave you some direction, some idea, some thoughts. There's not a perfect way to do this. 9 beekeepers, 12 different ways, and there's not a perfect way to do this. But just stay with it, pay attention to what you're doing, keep your eyes open, and realize that there's different situations demand different approaches. And there's not a set, solid way to do this, or if you see this, that, if that, this, Fall back on your club, fall back on your mentor. There's some tremendous websites. The one down at University of Florida, Jamie Ellis, is just a tremendous website. So just be a learning, observing beekeeper. Okay? Questions?
Hang on, okay. Yeah, I've got one more.
Okay.
So Sharon said today she moved 3 frames from a big hive. It had queen cups and lots of nurse bees and honey frames. Closed off overnight, and we'll remove screen in the morning. Made sure it had good circulation. Does that sound like something that...
You moved 3 frames off of it into another box?
Yes, I believe so.
All right. If you do that, you have to give them adequate stores. You have to feed them. And you want to do something to make sure that they have a queen or the potential to make another queen. Because just by putting frames in another box, frames of bees in another box, they may not have the resources to develop into a viable colony. You may just be watching bees gradually diminish, dwindle out until they're gone. Or you may see one of the worker bees develop into a laying worker, which again is another lecture. We don't even want to touch that tonight.
Right. Let's see. Yeah, it sounds like she's given them honey. So,
Okay.
so that sounds good. Lots of good comments, Steve. Lots of thank yous. Great presentation. Perfect timing. Excellent talk. All kinds of accolades coming your way.
Well, thank you.
And you did a
And what?
wonderful job. I said it was a great presentation.
Well, thank you. You